Lord of the Rings. Racial caricature perpetuated through visual elements, also known as the character design was pretty racist. I'm going to be talking about just the movies. I'll bring up the books because, the movies are an adaptation of the books. But for the most part, all of the racial stereotypes come from the movies. Orcs. Now you may think, oh, well they look like that. Obviously they've got to be caricatures of black people. They're not. I thought they were. Then I did research. They're actually mostly a stereotype of Asian people from the Yellow Peril. So this is an example of anti-Asian propaganda from the Yellow Peril. That looks a lot like the orcs in Lord of the Rings. So basically the Yellow Peril was just like white people hating Asian people. America pulled up with this stuff. It's like, by the way, Japanese people bad. And then Europeans went, well, you're white, and you're saying this, so it must be true. Europe has its own history of, anti-Asian sentiment. A lot of it comes from the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, actually. Just when, the Mongols came from Asia to Europe and invaded. But then the Opium Wars happened way later, which is basically just where China was like, hey, you keep sending us opium and now all our civilians are addicted to it and we don't think that's healthy, so we're gonna stop accepting opium in. And then Britain went, oh, but we're selling it to you. If you stop making all your civilians be addicted to drugs, and we're the ones selling the drugs, we're gonna lose money. So that was another big source of anti-Asian sentiment in specific to Europe and Britain, which is where Lord of the Rings comes from. As it relates to Lord of the Rings, most of it comes from these posters from the Yellow Peril era, because that's kind of what was in the public eye. That was what was being broadcast by the government and the media as to what Asian people looked like. Very dark skin, the pointed ears, the very big teeth with fangs, the squinty eyes. Oh, look at him. That's a pretty good example of how that was translated into character design. So this is the main orc bad guy in Lord of the Rings. His name's Lurtz. He's got the squinty eye, the teeth with the fangs, pointed ears, although you can't see it in this picture. Very dark skin. So here's another caricature. Don't worry, we'll come back to the other one. The Easterlings and the Southrons. They're an anti-Arab caricature. Yeah, this one's a pretty obvious caricature. This one also does stem from the books. In the books, there were the Easterlings and the Southrons who sided with Sauron, but Sam, the secondary good guy hobbit, specifically had a moment of reflection where he's like, oh, I don't think these guys are actually evil. I think they're probably being lied to or forced to work for Sauron. While they are represented as you're supposed to sympathize with them, you're supposed to see them as not evil, and the movies just get rid of that. This comes from a long history of Islamophobia in film. Here's kind of a stereotypical caricature of the evil Arab version. They've got the head and the curved scimitar. Specifically for Britain, where Lord of the Rings was written, and then it was filmed in New Zealand, but Europe. Islamophobia really hit it off in the 1960s, just because they were immigrating there. Hollywood has a really long history of villains being Arab stereotypes. I read an article that was talking about Islamophobia in film. The author looked at over 500 films from Hollywood, and almost all of them contained the evil Arab stereotype. And then I swear I'm not bringing this up in every class on purpose, but Islamophobia propaganda and stereotypes like this, just straight out of Israel when it was founded. Israelis wanted to take over Palestine. If they wanted to move into Palestine, then they had to make it seem like they were the best people to live there, which meant discrediting the actual people who were living in there, the Palestinians, Arabs, and just making them look bad so people would sympathize more with the Israelis who were trying to live there. Like, there was Islamophobia before then, but it was pretty much just like Israel got founded and then Islamophobia just popped off after that. Goblins! Now this may seem like a really obvious one. Goblins are anti-Semitic. I knew that right off the bat because like I used to be into Harry Potter, so I was pretty sure of the history already. I was like, okay, goblins are anti-Semitic because of Nazi propaganda. And I was like, hey, where did the Nazi propaganda get it from?
Hours later.
You're just gonna have to trust me on this one. From the movies! Got the pointed ears, the big nose with the nostrils, and you can't see this picture, but the one back here, forehead very slanted back. You can see that one compared to the normal human. God, Nazis were wild. So, you've seen like the visual elements, but then they go further. Like, they really dug themselves into a hole. They also said, we're gonna take the people who look like people of color, and then we're also gonna make them act like stereotypes of people of color. So, they did this through prosthetics, ritualistic scarring. So, the main villain in The Hobbit is Azog. This guy right here, you can see all of his scars. I thought all those scars were just because of, like, the first time we see him is during a war. And he's straight up missing an arm because of fighting. Like, he fights a lot, and he doesn't wear very much armor. So, reasonable conclusion is, these scars come from fighting a lot and not wearing any armor. No! Why would it be that way? The scars were similar to the choice not to wear armor, in the sense that they were a conscious choice on Azog's part. They weren't wounds from battle, but were self-inflicted modifications that might not actually be beneficial, but which made him more impressive. Ritualistic scarring is an indigenous practice very common, especially in African cultures. They give themselves scars to signify different cultural things. Every culture has some method of physically changing your body to look different, to fit different cultural norms of beauty or different cultural ideas. Like, every culture has it, but Westerners think ritualistic scarring is like extra bad because we have this preconception around scars that scars are bad. That, combined with the fact that Azog is the pale orc, which implies that all of the other orcs are not pale and have dark skin, to translate it roughly into human standards is like an albino black person. That's specific to Azog, but so many of the orcs have scars. Posture, pretty much all the goblins especially had hunchback, gnarled fingers, and the goblins and the orcs had warts and pus and sores, so like super diseased. You ever seen a villain? I guarantee almost every villain looks like this. They all kind of stand like this and they go. That's the caricature of Jewish people from the Nazis. What about facial features? Squished nose, pronounced nostrils, the elongated skull. Okay, almond squinted eyes, that one's pretty obvious. That just means They're probably Asian. The fangs, again, what I talked about with the Asian thing, and then the casting. A lot of the like background orcs, whatever, those are just background actors they could find. But specifically, for the three main bad guys in the Lord of the Rings movies, they are all people of color. There are no people of color in the entire cast except for the bad guys. What? Alerts. He's an indigenous, I don't know how to pronounce this, indigenous Maori person, so indigenous to New Zealand. He has dark skin because he's indigenous. Ugluk is another bad guy. Also, he's indigenous Kiwi, has dark skin because he's indigenous. Sauron, no websites had information about him, so can't give you a specific race at all. But I can tell you, he has darker skin than all of his counterparts. When the only people of color in the entire movie are playing not human evil villains? Why would you do that? What about costuming? Peter needed specific orcs in The Hobbit to stand out, so he explored different ways to use minimal costuming elements and different materials, such as bone, horn, and wood, as well as the more familiar leathers to achieve this. I mean, that doesn't sound too bad, until you look at them. They specifically describe them as grotty, and it says eliminated steel almost entirely from the palette of materials they wore. Jagged, uncomfortable, carapace-like silhouettes. Costumes of the orcs are specifically very pointy. Look like they're like the bones and the horns are sticking out. They look very sharp. They eliminated steel almost entirely from the palette of materials they wore. In the Lord of the Rings movies, they had a lot more steel. Hobbit, they didn't. But in the Lord of the Rings movies, that steel comes from Saruman, because he's the smart white wizard. He's specifically associated with industrialization, so he makes all these fancy schmancy evil looking weapons. But the Hobbit came before that, so the orcs didn't have metal. That doesn't matter that, every other race had metal. This implies they either didn't care enough to actually create metal themselves, or they weren't smart enough to create metal themselves. Both of which, very bad. What about the amount of armor? Nudity was very common. Like, when we first see Alerts, he's just naked, and he doesn't seem to feel any shame. Europeans associate nudity with primitivism and people of color. So there's a lot of, a bunch of the orcs from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit don't wear a ton of armor and are often featured, very close to nude. Weathering, what about the weathering? They weathered the main actors, so obviously they would have also weathered the orcs' costumes, and they would do it in the same way, right? The orcs' costumes are described as grimy and greasy, so that plays into those stereotypes of people of color as gross, ragged. A bunch of the costumes are cut and slashed, so they don't look even, they don't look purposeful, they just look kind of thrown together. And then the one that really hit me hard was, it says here, a technique that we used on our orcs was trapping fur between layers and then slashing the outer material to flick out tufts of fur, often using the natural directionality of the fur growth to create very interesting patterns and surfaces. Quite savage looking. What? They said that with a straight face. It gets so much grosser. It could also be done in a much more careful and considered manner and look quite beautiful. We started thinking about how it might be applied to dwarf cloaks. So the orcs are savage looking, and then the dwarfs are careful and considered and beautiful. I don't even need to explain that one. Body paint. You might know this as war paint. I couldn't figure out if war paint was like a not cool thing to say, but from indigenous sites, from indigenous people, they just called it body paint, so that's what I'm calling it. It's an indigenous practice. What? Indigenous? The orcs? No. All of the orcs' body paint has been applied to their faces for the purposes of making them look scarier. That's not good when you've already coded them as indigenous. Lurtz especially has this big white handprint smack dab on his face. The handprints were specifically used in indigenous culture to indicate success in hand-to-hand combat. Props. For the weapons of all of the orcs and the goblins, it specifically says the orcs and goblins can't make their own weapons. They use bone and they just take discarded weapons from other people. As I mentioned, like inability or disinterest in creating metals, and it specifically describes them as nasty looking and haphazard. The concept of these creatures, the goblins, as cave-dwelling scavengers who would build things out of loot ransacked from hapless travelers, harvested from the mountain slopes or things that had fallen down crevasses. They constructed ugly collections of bone and shards of flint, bits of discarded weaponry, or farm implements. And then another place specifically used the word primitive when talking about the weapons. Like, that pretty much sums up the other terms they've been using. Critical thinking, please. The theory behind our initial dress of Goblin Town was that the goblins were social enough creatures that they interacted with each other in the form of occasional games and had some sense of themselves as individuals. Though the dominating personality of the realm was undeniably the grotesque and hulking Goblin King. We thought of a common space where they all worked, but also imagined that each goblin had their own little private corner in the shantytown chaos of Goblin Town. They needed some kind of cultural identity, which took the form of totem-like effigies, but which also had practical uses. They were bat catchers. So that all seems like pretty good. They put specific thought into Goblin Town. They're like, this is how the goblins would have acted, this is their culture, this is how their culture would have impacted the way that we're gonna dress the set. Fairly good. There's some little bits in there of like a shanty town, like totems. Those are all a little icky and definitely indigenous coded. Once Peter walked around on the set, however, and he saw these strange little goblin structures everywhere, he had a lot of fun art directing the set dress himself. So the totems became even more macabre, with horse heads and bits and pieces of other animals, corpses dressed in crazy poses, and other decorative elements that the goblins, who take pride in their home, have presumably erected to prettify their dwellings according to their own tastes. So the set wasn't originally like icky gross. Originally it was just like, yeah, they're kind of like indigenous a little bit. They have their own culture though, like all of the goblins are individual, they're their own people. And then Peter Jackson, the director, walked on set and was like, but what if we also associated them with animal sacrifice? And then society. Oh my god. So you'd think all that was bad enough. It is, but they just dug themselves deeper. So, in the Lord of the Rings Fan Club official movie magazine, issue number 6, published in December 2002 through January 2003, specifically talks about some of the Uruk-hai Berserkers. The Berserkers are the first wave of Uruk-hai to be sent into battle. They wear bull-like helmets that hide their faces, although their muzzles don't refer to sentient beings as having muzzles instead of mouths. Their muscles are still able to snap through the opening in the helmet, so dehumanizing, like literally speaking of them as if they were animals. The concept behind the helmets is that as the Uruk-hai raged across the land on the way to Helm's Deep, they massacred any villagers and outlying farms along the way. In the process, they gathered the blood of some of these victims and stored it in hip flasks or goatskin bags. At the point of battle, they fill the berserkers' helmets with the blood, and in the process of smashing the helmet down onto the head of the berserker, they soak the berserker in human blood, therefore giving the berserkers intense bloodlust, basically giving the scent to a rabid dog, and building the berserkers' aggression to the most maniacal level. The idea is that the berserkers are so lacking in intelligence that, once given the tasks, they continue on regardless of the level of attack upon them. Why would you say any of that publicly? Like, that's so... Oh my god. Berserker, bad. Low intelligence, bad. Bloodlust, bad. Literally calling them rabid dogs, so bad. There's another group. They're literally called wild men, so that doesn't sound great. In the movies, they are pretty much white people, but they're also described as tribes. Again, indigenous coding. Who's to blame for all of this? I've narrowed it down to these three people are the big ones for sure. Peter Jackson, the director, he's definitely the big one. He's the director of all of the films, but everything had to go through him and get his approval before it could be put on the screen. So he had the opportunity to shut down like all of this. And then John Howe and Alan Lee, these are the two biggest, they're the most famous artists of Lord of the Rings. Like, they did a bunch of the illustrations for the books. Like, the cover of my version of The Hobbit specifically says cover illustration by Alan Lee. Like, Alan Lee and John Howe were the two biggest illustrators for Lord of the Rings. The books, just the fandom, and both of them were brought in for the movies to do a bunch of the character designs. And, like, that could be fine, but their art, both of them, is super racist. They started all of the visual adaptations of the books by making art that was very racist. And then, because they were the most famous artists for the Lord of the Rings, all of their work was pretty much taken by the public as that's what Lord of the Rings looks like. So the conclusion. These movies are just undeniably incredibly racist in their character designs. All the villains, they're all caricatures of people of color. And they don't even have an excuse of, like, it came from the books, because it didn't. And then another thing is that the Lord of the Rings is just such a cultural moment across the world. Both the books and then the movies to an even larger extent. They're such a cultural phenomenon that they undeniably impacted the development of all fantasy. Every fantasy post Lord of the Rings was influenced by the Lord of the Rings. And when a lot of the media around Lord of the Rings is pretty racist, then a lot of the media in fantasy is gonna be pretty racist. So just when you're watching fantasy movies, shows, reading books, playing games, just really be aware of how race is presented. Are there multiple races in this? What's the evil race? How are they supposed to look? Thank you, Peter Jackson, John Howe, and Alan Lee for making the fantasy world so much more racist than it should be. Just use critical thinking. And don't be racist. I read so many articles. Like, I've got this, the Lord of the Rings official movie guide, which goes into stuff about, like, how they did the movies. This one was very helpful. It's straight up just how did they make everything for the Hobbit movies. They have a whole chapter on just the bad guys. That one is specific to the Hobbit, but, you know, the Hobbit is a continuation of the Lord of the Rings movies, so they had to maintain the visuality of the Lord of the Rings movies when they were making The Hobbit. And then I read every single issue of the Lord of the Rings Fan Club official movie magazine. All the ones that were published between 2001, I believe, and 2004. Because all of this stuff just has, they have interviews from Peter Jackson, they have interviews and quotes from the people who were making the prosthetics and the costumes and designing the sets. So it really gives you like a really deep dive into what they were thinking, their thought process in making all of these decisions for what the orcs and the goblins and the Sauerons would look like.